I just want to introduce Ellen David Friedman. She spends, half your time, roughly half the year in China, in Guangzhou, teaching at the university there. She's a long-time labor organizer. You work with the Vermont Workers' Center? Mm-hmm. And she was one of the coordinators of the National Union of Healthcare Workers in the campaign, the California Nurses Campaign. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and she'll do a short presentation, and then we'll just have a discussion.
China, and even if we narrow it down to the topic of Chinese labor, is a little bit too vast for me to just plunge in without knowing some of the starting point of our audience. So I thought we might begin by just spending a few minutes, and I'd invite you to consider whether you have either a burning position on China, something you are certain about in China or have some conviction about, or a question. You know, what, as you look at this very large question about the development of the Chinese labor movement, what it means historically or at the present moment, where it's going, it might help me to frame the conversation effectively. So if anybody would like to sing out, that would be great. Please.
Sure. Well, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about two things, mostly the prospects for the Chinese labor movement to kind of break out of the ACFTU mold, sort of party union mold, and then the relationship between the Chinese labor movement and the American labor movement as it sort of tended to maybe mesh a little bit through, you know, SEIU and other kinds of stuff like that.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to hear something about the relationship of multinational corporations working in China to labor and to the state and to the Communist Party.
Great. Pertinent. Please.
Well, I'm from China. I'm Chinese, real Chinese. So I think my question is that I think there are two ways to go for this labor movement, I think. So we can take it to the right side, like make it libertarian movement. So to build something like a welfare state capitalism. Or you go to the left side, you restore what they had before in the first place, which is socialism, which they didn't carry out really. So there are two ways to go. So I think that's my concern.
Okay.
Well, I guess I don't want the big answers. I want to know a little more what you know, which is what it's like on the ground. And, you know, if a person who wants to make a living and left home to make a living for their family gets involved in this kind of labor organization, is China big enough, even though it's got one party, is it big enough for them to, if they get in trouble one place, disappear and make money someplace else? Or, you know, what kind of dangers do they take when they get involved in this labor movement?
Okay.
Are they blacklisted forever?
Okay. Lives of the people, yeah.
I want to know what lessons can be drawn for organizing among Chinese immigrant workers in the U.S. Since I'm involved in the unionization effort in Bridgewood and Queens.
We are.
With a union shop consisting mostly of workers who are Chinese immigrants.
What kind of shop?
It's basically a warehousing shop. They work for this company called Pure Pack, in which they deliver mainly food supplies and other related items to various Chinese restaurants and bakeries in say Flushing, Chinatown.
Really interesting question. I have no idea if I have anything useful to offer that from my Chinese experience, but as a labor organizer, it'd be very interesting to talk about that with you. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions to raise? Okay, well let's get started with that. Maybe just a small bit of sort of setting the table, what my experience is in China, and I'll first introduce my spouse Stuart, who is sitting here in the front row, because he is much of a partner in the way my life has developed in the last decade or so. So we began going to China about 10 years ago, largely because our son was beginning to study Chinese language. We now spend about half of each year in Guangzhou, which is the city we used to call Canton, southeast coast of China in the Pearl River Delta. It is very close to Hong Kong, right across from Hong Kong. Very large city. I don't know, 10, 12, 15 million people. It's hard to know. They sort of absorb other smaller cities nearby. Very, very large migrant worker population. And it is just north of the city of Shenzhen, which some of you may know about because, 20, 25 years ago, it was a little fishing village with 30,000 people in it until Deng Xiaoping arrived and said, this is where we will start the first free enterprise zone. And it became the engine, the flywheel for the introduction of modern capitalism and industrialization in China, and now continues to serve in some ways as the testing ground and the model of what is possible for the marketized economy in China. So we teach at Sun Yat-sen University. Neither of us are academics here. We both managed to be academics there. And I teach in labor studies, and Stuart teaches in social work. But we're both also, because we have just finished our 5th year of teaching at Sun Yat-sen. And so we have used this kind of unusual platform as an opportunity to dig deeply into our own sphere. So Stuart is very much involved in the part of the creation of what you'd say civil society through the emergence of social work in China. And I have managed to poke around and get involved in the labor movement. But I have to maybe start by saying when we say labor movement, and I think Barbara's question made me realize I better qualify this, it doesn't really meet our description of the word movement. The experience in China of workers, on the one hand, is perhaps, but not only perhaps, it is certainly the highest concentration, the most unbroken, ceaseless expression of spontaneous worker militance in the form of wildcat strikes that has ever existed anywhere on the planet. There may be as many as 100,000 wildcat strikes a year. None of them called by the trade union, of course. Most of them very short. We think of them as cellular or atomized, isolated. This means they are not connected to other forms of labor expression. They are problem-solving strikes. They occur when there's a problem of unpaid wages, or when overtime is not being calculated properly, or when the temperature in the shop floor is much too high, or whether some line supervisor is a particular kind of son of a bitch and drives people too hard. So they are to solve problems. They're very short, as I said. They are often effective, which means the problem is often solved relatively quickly. But this doesn't add up to being a movement. Part of the reason it doesn't add up to being a movement is because the workers themselves, as most Chinese citizens do understand, is that a certain kind of freedom of expression exists, but it must meet certain conditions. And one of the conditions is that it cannot link up with other groups, and it cannot become an organized, sustainable, ongoing institutional presence. So if the workers decide that there's something going on in their factory that they need to try and resolve, and they do that by stopping production going out on the street, that's okay. But if they were to try and elect their own officers, give themselves a name, say we are the, engine factory number 7 workers committee, and we have a list of demands, and we intend to try and have an ongoing presence in this factory, and we are going to talk to workers in other factories who do similar work, that would be met very quickly with severe repression. It doesn't need to be met with severe repression, so in answer to your question, in the recent period, and I say from 2005, I will call the recent period, during the time of the administration of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, there is much, much less direct repression of worker organization. So many fewer people being singled out, going to jail, being brought up on charges. Police, often when there are wildcat strikes, simply sort of stand back and observe what's going on and don't intervene if there's no property damage, if there's no political demands being made. So there is a very high level of what we could consider to be self-censorship. So when I use the word labor movement in talking about China, what I really mean is what are the different forms of labor institutions. By that I mean mostly the official trade union, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, the ACFTU, and what it is doing. A very small grassroots labor MGO sector, very, very small and very limited, of small, what we would call here like worker centers. And what are they doing? What is the law? What is happening in the law sector, the legal sector? What are scholars thinking about and researching? What are students doing? So the whole range of, activity and thought, but not a social movement. So that's, I would say, actually the first place to start. Why is there not a social movement of workers in China? Now, as you may imagine, to go to China and spend a lot of time there is a little complicated for a Marxist, for a foreign Marxist. It's filled with contradictions and confusion. And I can give you the illustration which I think clarifies it most often for me. I have a lot of relationships with students, and as I said, I teach labor studies and other fields, discuss social problems. And often I'll get into a relationship with somebody and we'll begin to have a lot of back and forth about the problems in China. And I think your point that you raised is one we hear about very often. I hear about from my students or from colleagues, or you read about in the media, which is that some people believe that the problem in China now is that there is still too much socialism left over from the old days, and that the transformation of China to a market economy has not been sufficient. So that the problems of government being too big and too bureaucratic and too controlling, that there's favoritism in hiring, that there is inequality in society, that there is a disconnect between production of goods and consumption of goods. These kinds of problems, some people blame on the fact that China is not yet capitalist enough. This, I would say, is a very widely held point of view by some scholars and some journalists and some government leaders, and certainly by the business leadership class. There is a very limited point of view, very small number of people, but it is beginning to grow, who say, the problem is not too little marketization, the problem is too much. And that when China, beginning with Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, began to turn its back on socialism, the gains of the socialist revolution, and began to introduce market reforms, what was lost was the ability of China to tend to the needs of its people broadly. Now, this is a small point of view, but it is beginning to grow since the 2008 economic crisis, which we can talk about in a moment. But the story that I was background to the story that I wanted to tell is that I have a very clear point of view on this question, which is, I often, in talking with students and colleagues, am very, very critical of neoliberal economics. The lack of regulation, the lack of protection for workers, the lack of protection for the environment. Completely, a very highly deregulated, for example, financial market, housing market. There is a housing bubble in China now of extraordinary proportion. Many problems that we recognize from Western countries. And when I am critical of this, and I continually raise the issue about the price being paid by 200 million migrant workers who are constantly flooding into the cities year after year after year to work for very, very cheap wages. And not only that, but the very low standard of living being experienced more and more by urban workers as well, as the problems of inequality grow and grow and grow. And when I bring these up, invariably the student will sort of lean across to me, look around to see if somebody's listening, and say, "Oh, you're a real Marxist." So this is because Chinese students study from a very young age, 14, 15 years old maybe, I don't know if you have experienced this yourself, study Marx. And I have not yet met a student who doesn't hate Marx and considers this to be a terrible, oh my God, this is the most boring thing that we could do. I compare it sometimes to like students learning, catechism perhaps. You must do it, you have to do it, you have to get your grade in your politics course, you have to memorize surplus value, what does this mean, dictatorship of the proletariat, okay, we've got that. But it has no meaning, it has no life, there is nothing vivid about it. And they think it's at base, they understand it's completely hypocritical. Whatever they have been taught about is not really what they're seeing in front of their eyes. So I have taken it as a small personal task in my work to try and reacquaint these Chinese students with Marx. And so I have Marxist reading groups, and every year we read the basic canon. First of all, they're often astonished. They say, "This is not what he said." I said, "Oh yes, I think so." No. Our textbooks say something very different. So first of all, they study Marx in textbook form, which means it has been rewritten to some degree. And the main point that is brought home to these young people is that Marx was very clear that you cannot complete the transformation, the transition to communism, if you have not developed the economic and industrial base first. And that's what needs to happen. And so the single-minded, relentless, permanent goal towards development of the GDP is what everyone is schooled to believe in and to strive for and to hope will redeem all of the sacrifice of the generation of migrant workers. It turns out that when some students now are observing the condition for migrant workers, especially after in sort of the last couple of years for a variety of reasons I'll mention in a moment, but when they begin to start to see the contradictions, and that China is now in what you might call its second, or some people even say third generation of migrant workers who have come to the city and labor under incredibly exploitative conditions, and they start to examine the reasons for this, and they read Marx, and they say, wow, how could he have known 160 years ago that this is what would be happening in China today? How did he know that? So I am pleased to say that there does seem to be the possibility of an emerging idea among some students and certainly some scholars that it is appropriate to use the tools of Marxist analysis and critique of capitalism to understand what is happening in China today. It's I wouldn't say it is widespread. It is certainly not considered a very reputable point of view, and students feel. I had a student in a reading group this past term who came from the economics department, which is a very conservative department at our university. The more progressive departments are at most universities. Sociology, anthropology, geography, and political science are the more progressive departments in many Chinese universities. But she came from the economics department, and she came to a reading group I was doing on neoliberalism, where we're reading, David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism. And she came to the first 2 or 3 classes and just sat there with her arms folded, sort of smoldering and shooting daggers at me, but she wouldn't say anything in class, in this reading group. And after some sessions, I finally sort of went out and talked to her afterwards. I said, well, I can see, you're very quiet in the class, but you don't look that comfortable. Do you want to talk privately? And she did, and we met, and she said, these ideas, I have never heard of these ideas before. I've never heard anyone in the economics department even use the word neoliberalism. And I don't even know what this is, what you're talking about. But she said she was uncomfortable about bringing it up or appearing to be either for it or against it because there were some other students in the group who were from the economics department. And she was a little concerned that if she expressed a point of view that was too radical, that these other students might go back and sort of report on her to the faculty in the department. So,
does that mean that the department did send people to report back on your class?
Well, I'll give 2 answers to that. I certainly assume that everything I do in China is well known. I'm very open about what I do. I assume that all of my classes and all of my reading groups are kind of openly surveilled. There is a dense internal structure within Chinese society. It is much thinner now than it was 30 years ago, but it still exists, in which every school and every workplace, certainly state-owned enterprises as workplaces, will have internal party organization and many other elected or appointed positions. There'll be study monitors and social monitors and sports monitors. That is, students will elect their own classmates to take care of the business of the class. It's very collectivist, which I enjoy. But then someone always has the job of making sure that, people in authority know what's going on. So yes, I think there are reports back, but the university is I would say it is probably the greatest bastion of openness that exists in Chinese society. And I have never been censured as a teacher. I've never been asked to not teach something. I have had some other experiences of being warned about some things that I was doing, but never in my academic relationships.
Do you see an emerging left opposition coming out of
So,
that?
do we see an emerging left opposition?
Or is
I'm
that
sorry.
a stretching?
Okay. No, not yet. And who knows if it will develop. But let's turn to this question now that I sort of started with. So the questions that I think a Marxist would ask, that I ask as a Marxist when I'm in China, are these. First, what are the historical conditions? What are the material conditions, particularly the conditions of production? And how have they shaped the emergence of workers? And what are the lives of workers like under these conditions? Objective conditions. And then subjectively, what are the political and social forces that create either opportunity or limit opportunity for workers, because that's my only interest. I am not at all interested in the emergence of the so-called middle class in China, which is talked about a lot in our media, but I That's not what I am addressing here. I am focusing entirely on the question of workers. So what are the subjective conditions and opportunities for workers in China? So as to answer this question, which is there any possibility that workers in China will be able to compose themselves into an industrial working class, into a proletariat, in Marx's meaning of that word? That means a class of people that recognize their relationship to production, that they are contributing to the creation of wealth, that is then taken from them by the capitalist and ends up being used against them, and that their powerlessness, their weak condition, their weak economic condition, their vulnerability, and especially the day-to-day compression that they are held under, is a function of that relationship of the worker to the capitalist. Because, as Marx told us, and so far, historically, every time industrialization takes place and the forces of capitalism start to unfold in a country, pretty much, so far, we have seen the development of an industrial proletariat. Maybe it's very small, sometimes it's rather large, but in virtually every country where this process has taken place, workers at some point come to this recognition and then take action on their own behalf, minimally to form unions, sometimes also to make political demands. Why isn't this happening in China? So that's the question that I ask myself all the time. So let me just spend a few minutes talking about how I have been answering that question for myself, and then talk about some recent changes that give me, I won't say optimism necessarily, but I will say, because, as many of you might know, if you remember Gramsci's favorite, or my favorite expression from Gramsci, that a revolutionary must have pessimism of the mind and optimism of the will. See things very clearly, see things very objectively, don't lie to yourself about what's going on, and even when things are incredibly grim, or it doesn't seem like there's any hope for liberation, nevertheless, our only choice as organizers, I know that at least there's two other organizers in the room, maybe various of you around here are also union organizers, we have no choice but to continue to hope for people's growing consciousness and awareness of their role in production, in wealth creation, and therefore in the well-being of society that they deserve to have some mastery of, some benefit from and some mastery of. So here's my best understanding of it. China after 1949, after the liberation, as you know, complete expropriation of all private ownership of goods. China was obviously it had not really been colonized, although there were certainly incursions by the Japanese and other Western foreign powers. But it was had not really made the transition from totally, obviously, out of feudal agrarian relations, very, very rural and developed. But when it made the transition, there was a very strong, steadfast commitment by the central government to appropriate the wealth that was there, which was largely agricultural surplus, and to turn it over to the purpose of rapid industrial development as best they could, on the basis of quite a relatively small, I don't think it ever exceeded maybe 15% of the population, maybe even less, of an industrial workforce. But the urban workers or the industrial workers, so I leave aside now the peasants, which is 80% or more of the population.
Still.
Not anymore, but certainly during the 30 periods of socialism, during the Mao period, it remained at 80% or more. It's now down to less than maybe 60% or less. I don't know, does anyone know? About 60% of the population is now rural. And it's hard to know, how do you count the 200 million Nomingong, the peasant workers who kind of flow into the city and then flow back to the countryside, and then their children flow to the city and flow back to the countryside, urban or rural. That definition has become a little bit fluid. Well, in any event, so a mass organization was established called the All China Federation of Trade Unions to represent Chinese industrial workers, but not in the sense we mean represent, not to represent in an antagonistic or an adversarial relationship to the employer, because the employer was the state, because the state held all wealth, all means of production. So, and it was a worker state. This is the framework for socialist countries that socialist countries have followed. Soviet Union, Cuba, China, Vietnam, the same pattern. So the unions, the job of the unions is not representation, but management, and social management and political management. So their job was to make certain that people had employment. It was kind of a full employment, policy, lifetime employment, had pension, had health care, compensation if they were permanently injured or disabled, housing, education, took care of the family's needs, oversaw the passing of the parents' job to the children, which happened, in the 50s, 60s, into the beginning of the 70s. Jobs were sort of inherited in families often. It was and also the solving of problems on the shop floor. So the trade union did that. But how this would happen was in a very informal, kind of a lateral and a pretty egalitarian way. There were some problems in the shop, and workers, a worker could say, we need to get this resolved, and talk to the union chair, so on, talk it out. Very, very little hierarchy, almost no bureaucracy, no hundreds of layers of levels of supervisors has developed recently. A paternalistic organization. After the period of economic opening up and reform that began at the end of the 70s, and as I'm sure you know, there was a large, massive commitment to reform of the state-owned enterprises, which means that large sectors of the economy were privatized. I won't take the time to get into it tonight, but the privatization process was often very, very brutal and very cruel to the workers themselves. Laid off from jobs, thrown out on the streets, literally, loss of pension, sometimes loss of housing, loss of health insurance. People in their 40s and 50s who really could never necessarily hope for any job again in their lives and were pauperized by this. And the trade union was asked to help preside over this. Their job was to manage this transition, not to protect the workers as this was going on, but to make it possible for the state to shed. There was a period of time, about an 8-year period in the late 80s into the early 90s, when about 90 million workers from state-owned enterprises were shed from the state-owned enterprises. And the union's job was to make sure that those workers did not become too radical and resist too much. Now, at the same time, we know that the private economy, the private sector, has just grown and grown and grown. But the government has told the trade union, your job here is not to represent the workers to demand increased wages and benefits and so on. Your job is to damp down those expectations and to make sure that the workers are actually not able to voice out those demands because the goal of the state is increased GDP, to grow the economy. If workers have too much power, if they have a union, an independent union, that is going to challenge the boss over the question of what happens to those profits and whether all the profits go into the boss's pockets or are shared by the workers, it will slow down GDP. So this has been the function of the union. The union is now some of you may be quite familiar with this in China, but it is a very large, powerful bureaucratic organization. It is an organization of the state. It is governed by the Communist Party.
What's it called?
The ACFTU, the All China Federation of Trade Unions. And it has political influence at the top, but underneath, hollow, empty shell. 200 million members, and I like to guess that there are about 199.5 million of them that have no idea they're in the union. They would be surprised to learn that. And if you ask them what the union does, they might say, oh yeah, once a year they take us on a holiday excursion to the beach. Or, yeah, I got a birthday card from the union last year. This is not an exaggeration. Survey after survey after survey, my own direct experience, all the researchers that I know, especially will say this is true in the private sector. So the union...
So this union represents private and public workers?
It does, but represent, again, is the operative word.
Yeah.
So the way in which the union gains representation in a workplace, of course it is presumed in the state-owned enterprises, and it has existed sort of since the beginning. In private, and when I say private, there's many forms of mixed ownership. There's joint ventures, there's direct foreign investment, there's Chinese capital, and lots of Asian capital, Hong Kong, Taiwanese, Singapore, Korean, and so on. But whatever the form of ownership, if it is not a state-owned enterprise, typically it's an administrative process where it's a cadre from the trade union, the appropriate district or municipal level will go to the employer and say, I'm here from the union, we now represent the workers, and sign over 2% of your payroll, because that's where the revenue comes from the union. 2% of payroll is the tax, basically, that employers pay to the union. So this is obviously not a stable situation, right? Workers, you're probably quite familiar with the high level of exploitation of workers, it's particularly in foreign-owned and export processing sectors. Very, very low wages. Wages have gone up in please.
Can you, even though they don't have much of a presence, does the union step in with the employer during these wildcats?
Okay, it's an excellent question, and historically that's exactly what they have done, because probably in more than 90% of the cases, the union chair is a manager, sometimes a very high-ranking manager of the company. So to have the union step in is sort of the same as having management step in. And they do, and historically they have definitely stood on the side of management. Sometimes they have mediated between management and the workers, but almost unimaginable that they would stand on the side of workers in these disputes. Now, just to sum up, this has had, as you can imagine, a dampening effect on the development of working class consciousness among these industrial workers. They are not allowed to form an independent union. That would be severely suppressed. The existing union, which is supposed to govern and manage them, does not help them to recognize their power or their voice or give them any channels to do that. And I should also mention, this is just an important feature I'll touch on briefly, is that one of the pieces of socialist legacy in China is that anybody with a rural household registration, or hukou, which is a system that was started in 1960 in China, so that you're where you were born, you get a household registration, and then that is where your citizenship rights are, where you can vote if there was voting, where you can go to school, where you can get medical care, where you can get where your Social Security money goes, and it is where you were allowed to live unless you have a sort of a work permit from your employer to be in another city. This system is undergoing a lot of change recently, but that's the basic underlying template. So peasants, during the reform period in China, the communes, the agricultural communes broke up, and every family was allocated a certain amount of land. Not a large amount of land, but enough to be able to support the family. And so this is a little bit different than what has happened in many other countries as they have industrialized. So in many other countries, peasants have to leave the land because they have, really no possibility of staying on it. Land is taken. Of course, that happens also to some degree in China. But they are forced to go to cities, forced to work in factories. In China, that is somewhat true because staying on the land will not give you a good living. But then what happens is when you get to the city and you've worked for a few years and you see that the life there is very grim and has no promise, and your wages are not going up. In fact, wages in China now for manufacturing workers are exactly at the level they were in 1983. Despite increases in the minimum wage, the effective wage, taking into account inflation, same as 1983. And wages as a percentage of productivity have gone down. Wages as a percentage of GDP have gone down. And most important, wages as a percentage of profit have plummeted. So that in 1983, wages accounted for 56% of profit, and now they account for 36% of profit. What does it mean? Well, when you think about profit, the
comparison profit, wages don't compose profit. Ratio?
Wages as a percentage of profit, that's right. So if you sort of account for what is the profit in a given year, cumulatively, as one of the costs of production, or not one of the costs of production, as one of the features or the factors, the results of production, and then you measure that against other kinds of inputs or other kinds of costs, machinery, rent, and so on. So it just means that, well, it's obviously what it means. What? The convergences, the similarities, the parallels in the development over the last 30 years between China and the U.S. and other Western countries is astonishing. Something we don't have perhaps that much time to talk about, but it is the same as here. So anyway, I just want to say about this that one reason that workers have not developed, I think, as a working class is because after a couple of years and things get a little grim for them in the city, they go home. And then maybe they'll spend a few years at home and working and farming in the village, and maybe they'll start a small business or maybe go back to the city and work a few more years. But there is no need to develop a permanent identity as an industrial worker because you have your main identity still remains as a peasant in the countryside. Summary, let me just say that things have started to change in some very dramatic and important ways. And specifically, this past summer, you may be aware, there was a very unusual strike wave in China. I've described a little bit what the wildcat strikes are like, so that when a strike occurs now, most people don't pay it very much attention. In last May 17th, 2,000 young men and women at a Honda parts plant that makes transmissions in the district of Nanhai in Guangzhou went on strike, and it was immediately clear that something different was going on because, among other things, they were not making a defensive demand. Mostly these are defensive demands. We want you to pay us back wages, or you should pay us the legal rate for overtime. This was an aggressive economic demand, and it was incredibly aggressive. They were demanding that their wages be doubled. That was the first demand. The second was that they wanted a process of collective bargaining. They wanted to know that each year they could return and have a have a series of meetings with the boss, and that the result of that process would be a guaranteed, predictable wage and wage increase every year. Unheard of that this would be made as a demand. There were other smaller demands, but the one that ranks highest in importance for me and maybe for some of us here, given what we are hoping for, is that these young people demanded the right to elect their own leaders of the trade union at the factory level. They were not demanding an independent trade union. There was some misrepresentation of this in the foreign media. There was quite a lot of excitement, I would say, among some American labor journalists, saying, "Oh, look, the Chinese workers, it's like Poland, Solidarność again, They're demanding an independent trade union." That was not what happened. They understood very clearly that that demand would have met with very severe repression, and so they were making a demand that was actually achievable. And in fact, the trade union accepted this demand, and now they have forced management in this factory to allow the workers to elect their own representatives. This strike was also unusual because it lasted for 2 weeks. These young people actually went out on strike. Management said, "Come in and talk to us. We're a family. We didn't know you were so unhappy. Come on, we can work this out." And these were young people. The average age was 20. 70% of these workers were student interns, because there is a vast use now, an increasing use of high school students who are in vocational school. They spend 1 year doing academic, academic vocational classes, and then for the next 2 years they are indentured essentially to a factory. They're paid a wage, but it's below the minimum wage, and they're not paid social insurance and so on.
Did you know that McDonald's lobbied very hard for an internship wage?
Sure.
Oh, okay, they said their contribution to forming the American working class, to giving people food.
Sure, because it's training and,
Below
after
minimum
all,
wage.
it gives them
Sub-minimum
experience, sub-minimum wage. This has actually been a constant struggle for many, many years. I mean, those of us who are old warhorses in the labor movement, we have seen year after year after year in state legislatures particularly, this idea of a youth wage or a so-called training wage. So that is in the law in China. So anyway, these young people, they said, "Okay, all right, we want to do collective bargaining. So if you're saying that's what you'll do with us, okay." So they went in and they met with management, and management offered them an increase of 50 renminbi a month on their food allowance. That's $7 a month, approximately. And they said, "Are you kidding? That's not what we're here for." And they walked out and they took everybody out on strike again 3 days later. Now, if any of you have been in a strike or managed a strike or know about striking, the idea that people go out and then come back into work and then you can get them out again, unimaginable. Unimaginable. This is very hard to do because the stress is very great on people. So they accomplished that. They stayed out for 2 weeks, much, much, much longer than the typical strike in China. And they understood what they were doing because their goal was to shut down production. And because they used, Japanese car company, they used just-in-time production methods, this meant after 3 days, transmissions were not going to the assembly plants. The assembly plants shut down, and then all the other parts plants all over China were forced to stop production. Because, as you can imagine, if you can't ship your parts, the assembly plant says, "Don't you ship us any more parts." No one's going to keep those factories open and running. The number that we heard, who knows what to make of this, the number that I heard most constantly was that during the strike, Honda was losing 300 billion renminbi a day for the last 10 days of the strike. 300 billion is, it couldn't be that much, 450.
45 billion $45 billion.
45 million. Oh, it must have been. That's too many zeros.
Yes. A lot of money.
A lot of money. They lost a honking amount of money. So now.
The workers in the other plants that were forced to shop closed because they didn't have the parts, did they say as long as we're out, we're on strike too?
Okay, here's what's happened. They didn't say they were on strike. There's a very interesting thing in China. When workers go out on strike, they continue to be paid.
Oh.
Yeah. As long as you're on strike and you stay in the factory compound, then you are considered to still be on the job. You're just not working. And so you're still paid. So these workers were paid that were on strike, and then the workers in the non-producing factories, the factories that essentially had been shut down for production, for production reasons, not for labor disputes, they were also paid. It was like a holiday for them. Although in some places, some of the factories made them force the workers to make up the days, so it wasn't like they got extra pay in the end. But what did happen was that the government allowed this strike to stay in the media and to be covered with an unusually high degree of frankness, detail, and analysis. Now, that's not what we always expect from the Chinese media. But they were reporting things like that these young workers had gone online and had seen that in Japan the counterparts who were doing the same work were earning 50 times as much as they were, and they felt this was unacceptable because it meant that this is a profitable company. And so they're beginning to make this association between my work and the profit that somebody else is taking, which is not at all how most of the strikes are characterized in China now. They don't really have to do with the question of how profit is divided. Most strikes in China previously have had to do with wanting the employer to follow the law, to adhere to the law. Just pay me the minimum wage. If you make me work on the weekend, pay me time and a half. If you make me work during a national holiday, pay me double wages. It's very different, though, to think about making a demand that is based on economic right to what you are producing, to the wealth that you're producing. Anyway, because of this coverage, and many people at the time thought that this was because the Chinese government was ready to start making a change on its cheap labor policy, which it has followed for 30 years. And that, in fact, they were willing to see the workers stand up and take the brunt of this first assault on employers to let them know that wages were going to have to start rising. And in fact, whether this was the goal or not, within the course of the next month, there were at least 2 or 3 dozen other strikes in automobile plants, mostly Japanese-owned. There is some question about whether this had a nationalist or, aspect to it. We can talk about that if you're interested, but I think it's much more complicated than that. In any event, the result of this has been, and it differs in different parts of the country. South China is understood to be the most open-minded, you could say the most progressive in terms of its ideas and labor relations and so on. And the result has been, in fact, that the ACFTU and its lower-level unions are now talking very actively about the need to develop collective bargaining as a mechanism to encourage the election of leaders at the enterprise level, to try and, as I say it, to preempt what could be a rising tide of worker militants. And again, to try and manage it, but this time to manage it under conditions of capitalist production, which means creating some industrial relations systems, including perhaps collective bargaining. So why don't I leave it at that? It tells a slice of a certain kind of story, and see if we have some questions or discussion.
Can I ask
Please.
one thing? Does China have a ration or an allotment system, like Cuba? You get 5 kilograms of rice.
No. Food is
So everything is
affordable. Food is, no one is starving, and food is freely available and sufficient, yeah. Yeah, please.
So what are some good sources in terms about the Honda strike that occurred back in May last year?
Good sources?
Yeah.
You can get, a lot is being written on it now, but one of the sources that I really recommend is a website. If you Google China Study Group, I mean, I know there are China study groups all over, but this is a Chinese-based China study group in Beijing. And what is the name of the guy that wrote, there is an Anglo guy who's in Beijing who has written excellent pieces. Anyway, that is one source. China Labor News Translation is another good source. China Labor Net and China Labor Bulletin, LABOUR, which is in Hong Kong. China Labor Net is also in Hong Kong. China Labor News Translation comes from Australia. And those have excellent sources of analysis and description. Yeah. Please.
Do you think there's a problem with communication that you said 100,000 protests a year? How does that not amount to anything?
Yeah.
Do these people not have internet access, or is there no media coverage of these events? Or what do you think about it?
Media coverage is very uneven. Sometimes what I have come to observe, just kind of from living there and what I find out from my friends, is that many journalists will take risks to get a story in to the media, even though they know it's sensitive. And so sometimes a story will appear, but maybe only for a day, and then it'll disappear off the net. But by the time it's appeared once, people grab it, and they'll be sending that all around, but there might not be any ongoing coverage. So media is uneven. Chinese workers, they have some access to the internet, but they don't have a lot of time. And often, they're quite exhausted and they're young, and their free time will go towards playing, video games rather than following the news. So I've interviewed, and my students have interviewed workers in these various factories that went on strike. Generally, someone will know that there was a strike in another factory, but it may or may not be widely known.
But you're pretty sure that you're very close to it. Because I'm thinking, okay, it's not solidarity. It's not possible that the people that went out there don't have some kind of committee that knows the people someplace else. But you're pretty sure they don't.
Okay.
That's
yeah.
saying, they're discussing the question, should we actually be part of the Labor Federation, or what should,
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
a thrilling experience.
My
experience you don't want to let go of.
No, I know. My assessment of it is that there are a number of, free-floating activists, people from Hong Kong, some people from the mainland, people who have come up through their own experience as migrant workers, who have been involved in strikes and so on, and that they go, when they hear that there's a dispute somewhere or a strike, they go there very quickly. We know what happened in the case of this Honda strike. We have first-hand knowledge of people that went there right away to be helpful, to do exactly what you're talking about, to learn about the experience so that they could make it available to other workers in other factories. But the surveillance mechanisms in China are very good. They're very serious. People do not really elude them. And one story we heard was that a guy showed up from the northern part of China on like the second or third day of the Honda strike with a suitcase filled with workers' materials, shall we say, and he was met at the Guangzhou train station, and he had his suitcase taken away from him and told to go home, and he did. We believe he did. So I don't think that there is what we would call worker-to-worker linking up going on very much at all. There may be some cases, I don't know that I would know. I don't know. They do. Now, I will tell you one thing that is incredibly cool to me. The second strike in this strike wave was at a Toyota plant called Toyota Denso that makes muffler brakes? What are they? Was it air conditioning? Electrical. Anyway, they went on strike shortly after the Nanhai strike. Now this is amazing, and I've had the chance to interview and talk with the workers who were part of the meeting that took place. The day before the strike, 200 workers. This plant has 1,700 employees. 200 workers met at a restaurant. I actually went to the restaurant later. It felt kind of historic. And they sat around in this restaurant and planned the strike. Nobody that I know has ever documented something like this before. And the way they decided to organize the strike was they said, we are going to make a policy of 3 no's for 3 days. The 3 no's are no work, no election of representatives, and no demands. And we're going for 3 days. If we make a demand, they're going to meet it, or they're going to co-opt it, or they'll do something about it. And if we elect representatives and send representatives in, those representatives may go and negotiate a deal. But if we stop working for 3 days, we stop Toyota production, and they did. So this is an understanding, a powerful understanding about how the chain of production works, and that after 3 days, all of Toyota production was stopped in China as well, stopped for about a week. So I'm kind of excited about this because it means this is the start, I think, of some class formation process in the Marxist sense of the word. They can see that they control production. They have power, which previously everybody has always thought only belonged in the hands of the wealth owners, whether it's the powerful government officers or the capitalists in China or the capitalists in Japan. But this idea that some power exists at this level is kind of unimaginable. So I had the chance to go and meet and talk to some of these teenage guys. Very rough guys. I mean, not rough, dangerous in any sense. They were just kids, but with a rural backgrounds, peasant backgrounds. I met with 4 of them, and one had finished 8th grade, the other had finished his, 12th grade, and 2 of them had been in vocational schools. Not highly educated, but they described the organizing process. And they said, well, yeah, we had this meeting with 200 people. That was preceded by a meeting the day before, 2 days before, by 30 line supervisors. So this I don't think has gotten any attention yet, although it will show up in some of my students' master's theses.
I don't think we should tell them.
It'll be out soon enough. Well, actually, the government knows about this because the trade union officials all know about it too. So what happened was, in the style of sort of neoliberal work processes, there are now many, many, many layers of supervisors in Chinese factories, right? And as soon as you have the production workers, the basic line workers, and then there are line leaders, and there's shift supervisors, and there's another many, 10, 15 layers of supervisors. The lowest level supervisors will always have been workers. They will have come up. And above that, above the very lowest level, they'll be college, university graduates who have never worked in the factory. Anyway, a bunch of these guys got together and they said, let's reach out to the workers and plan this strike. So something different is going on. Yeah?
I followed the strikes back last year.
Yes.
Oh, everyone's quite exciting, I know. But the question follows immediately after that is how far this can go. and how far the government will allow this to go. And
Yeah.
I know this probably fits into the whole political reform, which government is quite conscious about right
Yeah.
now. They know there's something wrong with the whole system.
Yes.
And there's, except those workers, except the capitalists, there are also some other people, intellectuals, like
Yes.
other students,
Yes.
and they have their own stripes sometimes,
Yes.
like Tiananmen Square, an extreme case.
Yes.
But there's also scholars point out there's conspiracy theory among capitalists, government officials, and intellectuals.
Yes.
They want to keep the status quo. Even though they are trying to, and they organize their own movement
Yes.
to reform, but that reform, to some extent, is not for the benefit of workers.
Yes.
So there are two types of reforms or movements going on. They cannot reconcile each other.
Yes.
Do you have any comment about that?
Yes, I don't disagree. I mean, I think that the government is aware of the pressures building up, of the fact that inequality continues to grow in China, which makes both students and workers and even so-called middle-class people very, very, very dissatisfied. There's a high level of concern about the stratification in society, and it's felt very keenly. So there's pressure at many different sectors in this way. We feel it among our university students graduating from an elite university. Many of them will not be able to get any job, much less a job that they think, reflects their level of education. The question will be whether this can be managed through means of social control and authoritarian, sort of soft but authoritarian control, or not. It could become unstable.
The labor movement can combine with students' movement,
Yeah.
or in so-called middle class, if there's any in China, and
Yeah.
they can converge together.
Well, again, I would hesitate to predict anything, and we have to say after the last few weeks, who would have predicted, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain? That was not really what we would have predicted. Who would have predicted Wisconsin? Who would predict we might be facing a general strike in Wisconsin? Sometime in the next couple of weeks, the Wisconsin AFL-CIO has just issued a call for a general strike if this law passes. So, without predicting, I would say that many students that I speak to are deeply, deeply concerned about the situation, the problems for workers, the situation they face as workers themselves, and are beginning to look more deeply for explanations.
But what about organizing outside of production? Community organizing, student organizing?
Very, very, very limited. Very limited space for that. There is, of course, a lot of organizing to resist land takeovers, which is a common problem in China. There are a few famous cases about middle-class communities organizing to resist let's say,
What do you
toxic
mean,
factories.
land takeovers?
Peasants having their land taken and then sold or leased for private use, and they're not
Eminent domain.
sort of eminent domain or piracy, whatever you want to call it, but very limited. That's not it's not tolerated very much. And I just realized that I had not yet had a chance to address your question about what have I observed, what can I say about the relationship between the Chinese trade union and U.S. unions. So just very briefly, there's been no contact at all between U.S. unions and Chinese unions from before the liberation in 1949. And since the liberation in 1949, the basic principle being for the U.S. unions that the ACFTU is a state-controlled, party-supervised organization. It's not an independent trade union. There is no right of free association, and therefore we, the American unions, will not recognize them. We don't want to have anything to do with them. It's kind of the basic position. So 60 years, have gone by, the last 30 of which our capitalists have had no trouble in going over and managing to overcome their distaste of the Chinese Communist Party and making friends. And so a few years back, as I know you're aware, the SEIU, led by Andy Stern, made some initiatives. They were, I'd say they were very welcome, even though I have myself a certain amount of analysis or criticism of the motivation, let's say, that might have been behind it. Nevertheless, I think it was very important for some union to make this gesture, and so there were some exchange visits, and then the change to win unions, SEIU, Teamsters, Unite Here, primarily established a memorandum of understanding a year and a half ago, maybe a year ago, something like that, for exchanges, maybe some shared research and so on. I don't believe that actually has developed into very much of anything, in part because Change to Win itself is not doing so well. But so there was that, and then there have been in the last number of years some gestures which are also, at this point still I would have to say kind of very formalistic, but some kind of start. So there is something of a kind of sister federation relationship between the Los Angeles Central Labor Council and the Shanghai FTU, and between the Guangzhou Labor FTU and the San Francisco Labor Council. And just recently, the Teamsters District Council in Chicago, that's headquartered in Chicago, established some memo of understanding with Shandong, the Shandong Provincial Trade Union Federation. So some of these things are beginning. I'm involved personally in quite a lot of exchanges and bringing people back and forth. May, who has just recently retired from a long career in Unite, has been and is developing further relationships. So there are individuals, some academics, and some unionists who are trying to make something happen. But it's very, very slow. Other countries are much faster than us, particularly Germany. And just yesterday, I saw that the labor organizations in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and who else would count? Iceland? What? Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, yes. Estonia? I don't think Estonia was part of it. But anyway, the labor organizations in the Nordic countries have just established some kind of protocol also with the ACFDU. It's hard to know what to do when your partner is not really a trade union in any recognizable sense of the word. So, any other, please.
What kind of, I had the opportunity to go to that conference that you were last
October or November,
and a number of the professors there, of course, they're in management, that whole development of labor studies being not a new phenomenon, but certainly more academic and so forth.
Yes.
How is the so-called academic literature taking up the issues that you're talking about?
Oh, that's a great question. Up until fairly recently, labor relations discussions in China were entirely dominated by what we would call HR, or human relations, the management side of labor relations. Really completely dominated the field. But there are, in recent years, there has definitely is some very serious and encouraging growth of a return to what we would think of as labor side academic inquiry. So I know of, let's say, about 20 or 25 academics, primarily in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, who are labor side scholars. Some of them are labor law scholars, They're beginning to develop not only a critical analysis of what's going on, but they also lead students into research and into field research and projects. And sometimes those projects include, kind of going out and working directly with workers. And what's best is this young crop of graduate students who are coming up now, who are really showing a lot of interest and passion and also some skill. So I think there is something there to feel encouraged about.
And they're publishing. Are they publishing?
They're so far, beginning to. So far, most of the publishing by labor scholars that we would consider to be kind of useful on our side are still from Hong Kong academics. But increasingly, there are mainland academics who are publishing, some of them in English and some in Chinese, and then it's being translated. There's still, I think people still feel a sense of restriction and some censorship over what they can say. They're sometimes fairly careful. Well, it's 9 o'clock. Oh, thank you. Sure. Thanks for your interest and thanks for your hosting.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.
My
for
pleasure.
coming,
On your mailing list, is anything that
I will. And I do remember.